and welcome to the fourth lecture in our 2021 series. I am Roland Kuschel, and Hargraves and I are co-chairs of the summer lecture series. We owe thanks to the OSHA volunteers and staff who have been working for months to make this series possible, and to Dartmouth's conference and events team who have guided us through the technology. We owe thanks also to our underwriters, Caldwell Law, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Kendall at Hanover, The Village, Wells Fargo Advisors, and to the sponsor of this event, Mascoma Bank. Let's give them all a round of applause. Be sure to thank them if you run into them around town. Now some housekeeping details. We ask that you direct your questions to us through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will accept questions during the speaker's presentation and during the break. Closed captioning is available. If you would like to turn it on, just click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter technical difficulties, please email osher@dartmouth.edu or call 603-646-0154. Again, those contacts are osher@dartmouth.edu and 603-646-0154. And now our speaker this morning is Julia Gelatt, Senior Policy Analyst with the Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Her work focuses on the legal immigration system, demographic trends, and the impact of local, state, and federal U.S. immigration policy. Dr. Gelatt earned her Ph.D. in sociology with a specialization in demography from Princeton University in 2013. Please welcome Julia Gelatt.
Thank you, Roland. And it's really nice to be here with all of you today. As Roland mentioned, I work at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and I'm joining you live from D.C. today. MPI is a nonpartisan think tank in DC, and we focus on migration trends and migration policies worldwide, but my specialty is in the United States. And our focus is really on how to bring data and evidence to improve the management of migration. We believe that if migration is well managed, it brings benefits to receiving communities, to sending communities, to migrants themselves, really to all of us. But it does require good management. So that's where our research, where our analysis lies. We also try to inform the press and the public. Our website has a host of resources. If you're ever looking for data on US immigration or worldwide immigration, I recommend our Immigration Data Hub as well. So again, I'm just really glad to be with you this morning. This morning, I'm going to talk about 4 topics. The first is to discuss some trends in immigration. And I argue that we are in some ways, a new era of immigration, different from the one that we've just passed through and from our longer history of immigration as a country. So we'll talk about those trends. Next, because this is where all the attention is in Washington, D.C. these days, and in immigration coverage in the press, we'll talk about what's happening at our US Southwest border with Mexico. What are some of the current events and what are some of the kind of medium-term trends happening there? Then we'll talk about how COVID-19 has affected immigration, especially legal immigration to the United States through some policy changes and just practical adaptations to the pandemic. And then I'll close with a discussion of some of the policy challenges ahead for managing US migration, which I think will bring us nicely into the conversation that I'm looking forward to having with all of you. So to discuss current immigration trends, this is kind of the big picture of immigration to the United States over our longer history. So the orange line here is showing the share of the population that's foreign-born, that's immigrants. I use the term foreign-born and immigrants interchangeably. You can see that a peak percentage of our population was foreign-born back in the late 1800s and early 1900s at 15%. And then that decreased and then grew again. And today, 14% of the US population is immigrants. So we're not yet back to that high that we were at, but we are approaching it. And then the blue line shows the size of the foreign-born population in the United States. And we have more immigrants today than we've ever had before in this country. 45 million people in the United States are immigrants who are foreign-born. And you can see the growth over time in the second half of the 1800s. There was kind of slow and steady growth in our immigrant population. Then to a combination of policy changes, the Great Depression, and some world wars, we saw a decrease in immigration through 1970. The US really quite drastically revised its immigration laws in 1965, and that led to really big growth in our immigrant population after 1970 and up until today. Just to give a quick snapshot, since legal status is such a hot topic in immigration, unauthorized immigrants, I wanted to give you all a sense of the legal status of those 45 million immigrants in the United States. So the biggest share of immigrants in the United States are US citizens, people who naturalized and obtained US citizenship. So 44% of immigrants are naturalized. The next biggest share, 28%, are people who have green cards for lawful permanent residence. So they're in the country legally, they have permission to stay permanently. A pretty small slice, 4%, are non-immigrants. Those are people who are on temporary visas, like an H-1B work visa, a student visa, something like that. And then less than a quarter, just 23% of immigrants in the United States are unauthorized immigrants. Those are people who either snuck across the border illegally, or they got some kind of visa to the United States, often a tourist visa, and they overstayed that visa and they're still in the country without permission. The purple bar on the right is showing that a small share of these unauthorized immigrants, about 15%, have some kind of quasi-legal status in the United States. You're likely familiar with the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That's a program for people who came to the United States as children and are now unauthorized immigrants. That gives some unauthorized immigrants the right to live in the United States and to work, but doesn't provide any path to permanent residence for citizenship. There are some other similar programs like temporary protected status, and some people are somewhere in the asylum pipeline, and that also gives some limited rights within the United States. This graph is just giving a different representation to kind of highlight how the growth in the immigrant population has changed. So this is showing the change in the size of the immigrant population by decade in millions. So you can see the steady growth in the immigrant population in the late 1800s, about 1 to 3 million per decade. And then that growth started to slow, and then it turned negative as our immigrant population shrank in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then again, starting in 1970, the population started to grow. It grew a bit more in the 1980s. It grew a lot by 11.3 million in the 1990s. And then that growth was a little lower from 2000 to 2010 and was quite a bit lower over the past 9 years. We don't yet have the 2020 numbers, but from 2010 to 2019, 5 million immigrants joined the US population. This slowdown in the growth of the immigrant population is a pretty big deal because it comes at a time when the population of the US is slowing in its growth overall. We saw from the results of the 2020 census that the US population saw its second lowest growth in recent history by decade. This is coming as, for those of you who were at the talk last week, know as the US population is aging, birth rates are declining, our working age population isn't seeing the fast growth that it used to have. Immigration has been a really big driver of population growth and especially of growth of our working age population because immigrants tend to come at young ages or at their prime working ages and really contribute to our labor force. So this slowing of the immigration coincides with the slowing of our overall population growth and is a pretty big factor and will be a big factor, as I'll show in a minute, in demographic change in the United States. So where does this slowing of immigration come from? What types of immigrants are no longer coming? It's not that there's been a slowdown in permanent legal immigration. So this graph is showing the number of green cards issued for lawful permanent residents in the United States by decade. So you can see that from the 1930s through the 2010s, even though we only have the first 9 years of that last decade so far, there's been a growing number of green cards issued each year. So it's not that permanent legal immigration to the United States is slowing. It's also not that temporary immigration to the United States is slowing. So a lot of people come to the United States each year as foreign students, as temporary farm workers. They come on H-1B visas, which are for high-skilled workers, often in the tech industry. The US has over time been relying more and more on temporary workers. This slide is showing the number of temporary visas issued by the State Department by year for 2010 through 2019. And you can see that there's been pretty quick growth in issuance of the H-2A visa, that's the farm worker visa. There's been steady growth in visa issuances for the H-1B visa, and for other work visas that I've listed here, there's been a pretty steady number or slow growth in the number of visas issued. So it's not the case that temporary immigration has been declining either. Where the slowdown really comes from is unauthorized immigration. So this is showing the stock of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, the number of unauthorized immigrants, and the change in that population year by year, according to 4 different estimates from us at MPI, from the Pew Research Center, from the Center for Migration Studies, and from the Department of Homeland Security. In the 1990s and the 2000s, this population, this unauthorized immigrant population, grew really, really quickly. There were, on average, about 500,000 unauthorized immigrants joining the US population each year in certain periods. But in 2007, the unauthorized immigrant population peaked. As the Great Recession hit, and as conditions changed in other parts of the world, the unauthorized immigrant population stopped growing. And depending on whose estimates you look at, the population either has been decreasing since then or just sort of stagnated. So this is really what's driving that slowdown in growth of the immigrant population in the United States overall, is that there hasn't been this growth anymore in the unauthorized immigrant population. If you focus specifically on the Mexican unauthorized immigrant population, which is of course the biggest part of the unauthorized immigrant population, that definitely has been declining. By all of these estimates, that population has been declining and shrinking. So what's really driving the slowdown again is this decrease in the growth of the unauthorized immigrant population. So this is just to kind of emphasize a point I was making about the fact that immigration is really key for driving the growth of our labor force in the United States. So here the gray bars are showing US-born people with US-born parents. That's sometimes called the third immigrant generation. The blue bars are showing children of immigrants, and the orange bars are showing foreign-born people, immigrants themselves. And this is showing the growth of the working age population by decade. And what you can see if you focus on that last bar, which is a projection from 2020 to 2030, is that if it weren't for immigrants and their children, our prime age, our working age labor force would actually be shrinking. It's only because of past waves of immigration and their children, and because of current waves of immigration, that our labor force is growing. So this slowdown in immigration will bring a slowdown in the growth of our working age, our labor force population. If we expand immigration, that likely would lead to an increase in our labor force as well. But we're also benefiting from past periods of growth in our immigrant population through children of immigrants joining the labor force. In addition to this change in the pace of growth in the immigrant population, we've also been seeing, of course, a change in the origins of immigrants coming to the United States. Of course, we all know that in the 1800s and early 1900s, immigration to the United States was mostly from various parts of Europe. As our immigration laws changed and as factors around the world changed, that shifted over time, and a growing share of immigrants in the United States were from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. But that Latin American share actually shrank between 2010 and 2019, while the share of immigrants from Asia continued to grow, as did the share of immigrants from Africa, which is a pretty small portion of our immigrant population, but a growing one. if you focus on particular countries, you can see a bit more sharply how this is happening. So we passed through a period where most immigrants coming to the United States were from Europe, and then we passed through a period where most immigrants were coming from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, but primarily Mexico. But the Mexican-born population in the United States has actually been shrinking since 2007. This is showing the population by decades, but if I had shown you by year, you would see that that peak is actually in 2007. So the Mexican immigrant population grew tremendously from 1970 to 2007, and then has been declining ever since. And there are a number of factors for this. One is that this is, to some extent, an aging population. Some of this is people who have been living in the United States and passed away. But the bigger story is that when the Great Recession hit in 2007, it affected particularly high immigrant jobs. So a lot of immigrant men from Mexico were working in construction, and that was the hardest hit industry in the Great Recession. Also, leisure and hospitality, hotels, restaurants, amusement parks, all the fun things that people stop spending money on during a recession. Also, those industries employ a lot of immigrants. So the job market in the United States was bad for immigrants during the Great Recession. At the same time, Mexico's economy was improving. There were some security improvements in parts of the country. And maybe most importantly, Mexico's birth rate was declining. So through the 90s and the 2000s, there were a lot of young people each year trying to join the Mexican labor force and looking for work. And some were able to find jobs, and many were struggling to find jobs and looked to the United States for economic opportunity instead. But as the birth rate in Mexico declined, each year there were fewer people looking for jobs or newly entering the labor market, and the economy was also getting better, which meant that there was much less migration pressure to the United States. So that's probably a big factor behind this decline. The late 2000s were also a period of really intense immigration enforcement. There were high numbers of deportations, including of Mexicans, so that may have been a smaller piece of the puzzle. And the US has been investing heavily over the years in border enforcement. So it was becoming harder for unauthorized immigrants to sneak across the border into the United States. And for those who did, there were more consequences that made it harder to come back. So while Mexico is no longer driving the growth in immigration, a lot of other countries, a really broad mix of other countries, are filling in. So we see in this graph high growth in the immigrant populations from China and especially from India. We're also, of course, seeing growing immigration from Central American countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. I also put Venezuela on here. Venezuela, of course, is experiencing a crisis, and many Venezuelans fleeing the country have stayed in South America, but some have made their way to the United States. And I could have put a lot of other countries on here to show which immigrant populations are growing. Our immigrant populations from all over the world are growing. And so that's why I argue we may be in somewhat of a new era. We passed through an era of European migration and then an era of Mexican migration, and now we're in an era of diverse immigration to the United States. Okay, so now we'll turn our attention to what's happening at the southwest border. This is what's dominating the news and also what's dominating policy conversations in Washington, D.C. It's become very difficult for Congress to talk about immigration issues other than the border because a lot of members of Congress are really concerned about what's happening at the southwest border and believe that until the border is under control, in their view, no other immigration laws should be passed. So what is happening at the southwest border? Next, this shows the number of encounters between Border Patrol and migrants at the southwest border month by month for the last several years, from fiscal year 2013 through the current fiscal year. And we're about to get the July data, but so far we have data through June. And you can see that this top line in the graph is fiscal year 2021. This fiscal year, there have been more border encounters than in any recent fiscal year, including 2019, which was a year of really high numbers of border apprehensions. And these numbers have been growing through the summer when sometimes they start to decrease. They decrease because the border area is so hot that it becomes very dangerous to cross. But they seem to still be growing. It sounds like the July numbers will be even higher. So this is, in some ways, quite a surprising phenomenon. Some people say this is because migrants see President Biden as more welcoming They see new opportunity in the Biden administration. Another theory is that a lot of people would have wanted to come to the border last year, but because of COVID-19, we're unable to travel. So maybe we're seeing 2 years of migration happening at the same time, a kind of catching up. One thing that's behind the higher numbers, a small factor, is that there's a new policy at the border because of COVID-19. So starting in March 2020, President Trump's administration said, using an old public health law, we determined that it's not safe for the public health of the United States for people to come across the border. This is a public health threat. So rather than being able to present asylum claims at the border, rather than being put into formal removal proceedings, when people come to the border, we'll simply turn them right back around. If they're from Mexico or Central America, we'll send them right back into Mexico. If they're from other parts of the world, maybe we'll detain them and put them on a flight back to their country, but they won't go through any formal process. We'll just, tell them to go home, basically. That's called an expulsion policy. Because of the expulsions, people who are being sent back to Mexico are more likely to try again to come to the United States. There's no consequences, basically, no time in jail or prison. There's no formal deportation order. So people are sent back, they try again, are sent back, they try again. So in June, 34% of people who were apprehended at the border had been encountered by Border Patrol before. They fingerprint people, so they know this. That compares to about 14% in prior years. So to some extent, the higher numbers this fiscal year are inflated by these repeat crossers. But even if you accounted for that, this would be a really high year of border migration. This gives you the same type of statistic, but in a longer historical view. So this is Border Patrol apprehensions by fiscal year going all the way back to the 70s. So you can see the growth of apprehensions through the 70s and 80s, some up and down, but growth in the 1990s, and then a peak of 1.6 million apprehensions in the year 2000. And then after that, there was a big decline. And from 2010, 2011 through 2018, border apprehensions were at historic lows. This was a period where we at MPI and others were saying, wow, we passed through a period of really high border crossings in the 1990s and the 2000s. That was a period of a lot of Mexican adults coming to the border, but now, because of changes in Mexico, because of increased border enforcement, we've got the border under control. People really aren't trying to come illegally across the border in the same way that they were in the past. This is kind of an issue that we've solved. We're in a new era at the border. But then, things changed. In 2019, we saw really high numbers of border apprehensions. And then COVID-19 happened, numbers were down, people were being expelled. And then here we are in 2021, again, with really high numbers. So it looks like in terms of numbers, we're headed back to the levels that we saw in the early 2000s. But who's coming to the border is really different than it was back then. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the people coming to the Southwest border were mainly young, single adults, mainly men from Mexico. They were trying to evade detection from Border Patrol. They were trying to sneak across the border, pass the Border Patrol, and get into the United States to work and earn more money than they were able to in Mexico. But we've been seeing that that's been shifting in several ways. So in the first way that I'm showing here, the national origins have been shifting. So a decreasing share of border apprehensions are Mexicans. That's been a little up and down in the last several years. And a growing share are from Guatemala and Honduras in particular, and also El Salvador. The Salvadoran share went up and then has gone down a bit in recent years. There's also this interesting trend of growing border apprehensions of people from the rest of the world. So this year so far, 17% of border apprehensions are from somewhere other than Mexico and Central America. This is a pretty new story, and it's a very diverse story. The people being apprehended are coming from Haiti and Cuba, but they're also coming from Venezuela and also from Cameroon, from India, Bangladesh, from Romania in one interesting example. And so this is increasingly a global story of people coming from all around the world seeking to enter the United States through the border. It's still a pretty small number, but it is interestingly a growing share of border apprehensions. We've also seen changes in the demographics who's coming. So again, it's no longer necessarily single adults from Mexico. Increasingly, we're seeing families and children coming to the border. In 2019, actually, the majority of people apprehended at the border were families and children. This year, it's the minority of border crossers, but still a pretty big share. And you can't tell from this graph, but this year, we've actually seen an unprecedented number of unaccompanied minors, of children traveling to the border without a legal guardian or parent with them. So that is kind of another new story that we're seeing. And when these folks come to the border, when Central American families and children come to the border, they're not trying to sneak across. They're not trying to evade Border Patrol. They're actually trying to find a Border Patrol agent in most cases. And the reason that they want to find a Border Patrol agent is that they want to present their asylum claims. They'll say, I'm afraid to go back to my home country. I would like to seek protection in the United States. That triggers a process that now takes years, in most cases over 3 years, for someone to have an initial screening interview and then be put into long-term immigration court proceedings. And then because the immigration courts have a backlog of now over 1.3 million cases, people wait for years inside the United States for their asylum claims to be heard. And there are a lot of different types of asylum claims that Central Americans are presenting, and a lot of push factors that are pushing Central American migrants and families and children to the United States. So whereas the Mexican immigration we think was primarily economic. Some people may have been fleeing violence in their cities, but a lot of people were coming for economic opportunity. But from Central America, it's a very mixed story. Some people are fleeing poverty. A lot of people are fleeing gang violence and extortion that happens in their communities. Some people are fleeing gender-based violence, domestic violence. There's also, we know, political corruption and political issues in all three of the Central American countries that are driving big numbers, as well as, poverty caused by a number of things. The coffee industry is important in some of these countries. There have been issues like coffee rust. There also have been issues with drought. There's what's called a dry corridor running through Central America that's affected the crops, not just coffee, but other crops of many Central American farmers. That has led to hunger issues in some places. And then, of course, there were 2 hurricanes that devastated parts of Honduras and some parts of Guatemala last year. So that devastation and the lack of a lot of assistance from the local governments is also driving people to the United States. And we can talk in the discussion about how these push factors fit with our asylum policies. But a lot of people are getting to the border and asking for permission to stay in the United States, which again, as I said, puts them into this years-long process. And in the meantime, they're allowed to stay. So who is coming to the border is really different. And because of that, what happens to them after they get to the border is also really different. This graph is illustrating the impact of that CDC public health order that I mentioned was put in place during COVID-19. So starting in March 2020, the Border Patrol started turning people around, expelling them back to Mexico or back to their home countries because of this public health concern. So the blue part of the graph is people who came to the border and were expelled. And the red part of the graph is people who were treated in some other way. That some other way could mean that they were put into an expedited removal proceedings, or it could be that they were processed into the United States and, as I mentioned, placed into those long-term immigration court proceedings that leads to a years-long backlog. Over the last several months, larger shares of migrants have been allowed to come into the United States as the border crossings have increased. What's happening is that for the most part, single adults are still expelled. They're still sent right back around. Unaccompanied children are not expelled. They're transferred to a system of shelters that's specifically designed for children and then reunited with sponsors. That could be a parent, some other relative, a neighbor, a foster parent. in the United States. And then families coming to the border, some of them are expelled, some of them are let in, and it's kind of a game of chance for families to know what will happen if they come to the US border. All right, so that was kind of an introduction to this section of how COVID-19 is affecting immigration. But I wanted to give kind of a more comprehensive picture of how COVID-19 has affected US immigration policies and also processes, and how it's affected the number of people coming to the United States. So the US put into place a lot of policy changes and practical changes related to migration. Some of these were just very common sense, necessary adaptations to the fact that we were suddenly living and working in a global pandemic. But COVID-19 also created an opportunity for the Trump administration, which was very skeptical about the value of immigration, whether illegal or even legal. And so COVID-19 gave the opportunity to enact some policy changes that had been difficult to do with only the executive branch before the pandemic. So first, and probably, this probably had the biggest impact on immigration levels. Starting in March 2020, US consulates and embassies abroad paused their visa processing. In many cases, they shut down almost all of their services. At the embassies, staff went home. People were kind of hunkering down during the early pandemic time. And then it wasn't until late summer that consulates started opening up slowly again for visa services. But that was a phased reopening, and it's been very uneven across the globe. In many consulates and embassies across the world, operations are still slower. Some are still not processing all kinds of visas, and many are operating in countries where vaccination rates may be low, where COVID outbreaks are ongoing, and where it's not safe for staff to work at full capacity. So consulates and embassies are really important because that's where people who want a green card to the United States from abroad through an immigrant visa, or people who want a temporary visa to come to the United States as a tourist or a temporary worker, as a student, that's where they apply and where they have, in most cases, an in-person interview in order to make sure that they're eligible for that visa, that they don't present any security threats, et cetera. So those face-to-face interviews, of course, became really dangerous during COVID-19. And that's why a lot of visa processing was paused. And I'll show you what impact that's had on immigration. But the State Department reports that there are 500,000 people who have shown some kind of eligibility for an immigrant visa to the United States, so to come and get a green card in the United States, but are waiting to schedule their in-person interview at an embassy or consulate. So a backlog of 500,000, that's compared to a backlog of just 61,000 before the pandemic. That's an enormous backlog for them to try to work through while they're still not at full capacity. The second practical change that happened was that US Citizenship and Immigration Services, that's the agency that looks at all kinds of immigration applications within the United States. They also shut their offices when the pandemic hit, sent workers to work remotely, and still are not operating at full speed in many ways. So some people get their immigrant visa from abroad, but other people are living and working legally in the United States, so they apply for a green card from within the United States. US Citizenship and Immigration Services would process that. Other people might be on one kind of visa in the United States, like a student visa, and they want to change to another kind of visa, like an H-1B temporary work visa. They apply at USCIS. Because of this slowdown in processing at USCIS, their backlog also grew. Before the pandemic, they had a backlog of 5.7 million applications, which is already a huge backlog, of course. But today, that backlog now stands at 7 million. So that's been a big increase in their backlog as well. And each of those applications is someone who's trying to get permission to work in the United States, to stay permanently in the United States, to get some kind of protection. So that slowdown and the waits that people are experiencing are really consequential. So another type of policy change that happened during COVID-19 was that the US put into place a series of bans on immigration from countries that were experiencing COVID-19 outbreaks. So this started in January. At the end of January, President Trump said anyone who's been in China in the last 14 days cannot come to the United States because of the COVID-19 outbreak there. That ban was quickly expanded, first to Iran, then to most of Europe, the whole Schengen area, and the UK and Ireland, then to Brazil, and the latest addition to the list was India, as they experienced the big outbreak this early summer with the Delta variant. So all of those bans are still in place. Countries have been added, but countries have not been subtracted. So there are people all around the world who would like to come to the United States, but it's very difficult for them to come. In some cases, maybe they can go to some other country for 14 days in order to apply to get to the United States, but that can be really difficult if it's hard for them to get a visa to apply somewhere else, and if consulates in other parts of the world don't want to process their visas. So that has slowed a lot of immigration and a lot of tourism to the United States. Of course, in March of last year, we also closed our borders, our land borders with Mexico and Canada to non-essential travel. There are a lot of exceptions to those border closures. So what it mostly means is that tourists can't cross between the US and Canada or between the US and Mexico. This, not only blocks our ability to take vacations in cool Canada in the summer, but it's also affected the economies of border communities. A lot of people, especially along the US-Mexico border, travel across the border in one direction or the other to do shopping and other kinds of business. And that has been prevented by these closures. I mentioned already the Title 42 expulsions at the border. That's that CDC order that I mentioned that says that people coming to the border were just turned right around without hearing asylum claims, without processing them into removal proceedings. So we've talked about that. And then the last policy change of these many policy changes was that President Trump put into place 2 different types of bans on immigration. And what was interesting about these bans is that they were based not on public health grounds, but actually on economic grounds. So in April of last year, of 2020, President Trump said that he was going to block most types of permanent immigration from abroad for employer-sponsored workers and many categories of family-sponsored immigrants, because they would compete with US workers for jobs in a time of really high unemployment. So that ban was put into place. And then in June, he expanded the ban and said, not only am I going to block a lot of permanent immigration, I also am going to block most temporary workers from abroad, because again, they're competing with US workers. There aren't enough jobs right now. A lot of people are unemployed. This is not in our national interest. And the president does have broad authority to block immigration if he can cite some kind of grounds of national interest. So these bans went into place. President Biden ended the ban on permanent immigrants in February of this year, and he allowed the ban on temporary immigrants to expire at the end of March. So these bans are no longer in place, but they were in place for quite a long period. So I wanted to show you how that's affected legal immigration to the United States. This is showing the number of green cards issued for lawful permanent residents in the United States by year. And this number has been pretty steady at an average of about 1.1 million green cards per year over recent years. But in 2020, in fiscal year 2020, which is a fiscal year that was only half affected by the pandemic, right? The fiscal year runs from October through September. So the first part of fiscal year 2020 was pre-pandemic, but the second half was strongly affected by the pandemic. And in legal immigration, permanent legal immigration fell 31%. There were roughly 700,000 people getting green cards instead of that 1.1 million. Next slide. You can see the impact of COVID-19 and of our consulate and embassy closures even more sharply looking at these numbers month by month. So this is the number of immigrant visas that were issued by month. And you can see that the number fell incredibly sharply from January to April, when the pandemic was in full effect and when embassies and consulates were closed. And then there's been some recovery, especially this summer, in the number of immigrant visas issued per month. But again, there's still a really big backlog of people who are waiting to get their immigrant visa to come and live permanently in the United States. Okay, so this is showing temporary immigration This is the number of non-immigrant visas, of temporary visas issued by year. The majority of these visas are actually going to people who come as tourists, who come either for vacation in the United States or come for some kind of business meeting, business trip to the United States. But this group also includes those temporary workers, foreign students, others who are coming for longer stays. And what you can see is just, again, that the number of temporary visas issued fell by over half between 2019 and 2020, and then has fallen even more this year. We're only 9 months into this fiscal year. I have data for 9 months of this fiscal year, but it looks like we may be on pace for another very, very low year. And this is really likely because of decreased international tourism, as COVID-19 is still happening, as we still have a lot of country-specific bans in place. People are making individual decisions to try to stay safe from the pandemic, and mobility around the globe is just a lot more difficult this year. So in terms of temporary visas, we're still very far from normal. And then again, this just shows the numbers of temporary visas month by month instead of year by year. So you can see that really quick drop between January and April in temporary visas issued. And you can see that there's been less recovery in the number of visas issued month by month for temporary visas. So all just to show that COVID-19 had a huge impact on legal immigration to the United States. And if you remember, towards the beginning, I showed you how immigration to the United States is slowing. So these impacts of COVID-19 are likely only exacerbating that slowing of immigration to the United States, which again, of course, has big implications for our overall age structure and our labor force in the US. Great, so as we move towards the discussion, which I'm looking forward to having with all of you, I wanted to talk about some of the policy challenges that are facing US immigration policy today. The conversation in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned, is really dominated by what's happening at the border. But before the pandemic and before the current border trends, there was wide agreement that our immigration system is broken. There are a lot of issues and a lot of problems with US immigration policy, and those problems remain. They've just been joined by new problems that have been brought by recent developments. So here are just some of the issues before the country. So again, this dominant issue is managing the border. And the question here is really, how do we perceive these people, these Central American families and children in particular, showing up at the border? Do we see them as illegal immigrants, as a border that's out of control, as something that should be responded to with immigration enforcement, with tightening up our border policies and preventing people from coming in? Or in kind of an extreme opposite view, are these people all refugees? Are they humanitarian migrants, and we should respond with a generous asylum system and protections for more types of people, presenting more types of issues at the border, or something in between? Our border policies aren't always great at distinguishing between different types of migrants, and it's especially hard to have good processing when numbers are so high and when the border infrastructure isn't necessarily built to accommodate such large numbers. So how can we improve processing? How can we improve our asylum system, our immigration court system? How can we better respond to migrants at the border? And how should we respond to migrants at the border? These are really big policy questions facing our country. And closely related to that is kind of the deeper question of how can we address all of these factors that are leading people to show up at our border? If Central American countries had, strong democratic institutions, and there wasn't corruption, there wasn't gang violence, there wasn't poverty and hunger, there was safety for people, maybe there wouldn't be so many migrants. So what can the US do to try to create those conditions where people don't need to migrate? That's what Vice President Kamala Harris has been charged with, a seemingly impossible task of addressing all of these root causes, which we know will take time to address. And the United States and Mexico are quite committed to this challenge, it seems, but it's definitely a thorny one, and how to best achieve these changes in the shorter and longer term. Those are big policy questions. Another big and question and hot topic is what to do about the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States. This is a population that's been with us for some time. As we've seen that the population is no longer growing, it's also a population that's been in the United States longer. 60% of unauthorized immigrants have been in the US for 10 years or longer. Many have US citizen children. Many have been paying taxes for a long time. They're contributing to the US economy through their jobs. And many have no way to ever get legal status or citizenship in the United States. There's not a line for them to get into. There's not a form they could fill out to get a green card. They're really stuck without status unless Congress does something. But the question before the country is, should Congress do something? Should Congress offer some or all of these unauthorized immigrants a path to legal status and a path to citizenship? Or should we be enforcing our immigration laws more harshly? Should we have higher interior enforcement and ramp up deportations of people in the country illegally, maybe even if they've been in the country a long time, even if they have US citizen relatives, et cetera. So those are kind of the two opposite approaches, either enforcement or legalization, or maybe something in between. And it seems that Congress has been, over the last several years, has been particularly focused on one subset of the unauthorized immigrant population, and that's dreamers. So again, those are unauthorized immigrants who came to the United States as children. This is a particularly sympathetic population because many would argue they didn't make the decision to break US immigration laws. It was their parents who brought them across the border without permission, or their parents who brought them on a visa and then overstayed with them beyond the length permitted by that visa. So Congress has debated various forms of what's called the DREAM Act to offer them a path to citizenship. The House passed a bill this year, the Dream and Promise Act, that would create a path to citizenship for dreamers. But the Senate hasn't considered that. Democrats are currently pushing for some kind of legalization through the reconciliation process, through a budget bill that only requires a simple majority in the Senate and, theoretically could be passed on party lines. There are a lot of legal questions and political questions about whether this will be feasible. But that's one attempt to try to offer a path to legal status for dreamers and also for other sympathetic populations, maybe such as farm workers who have worked in the United States for a certain period of time, or other essential workers, those people who kept us all safe and fed and clothed and able to stay safely at home during the pandemic, which included a lot of unauthorized immigrants. Another big policy question in a too long list of big policy questions is what should be the United States responsibility in kind of the global humanitarian migration system. So how many refugees should we let in? And what should be, our commitment relative to other countries in the world to responding to refugees? The United States has never let in even a tiny fraction of the globally displaced population. So there are millions and millions of people around the globe who have fled their countries because of persecution or civil war, or other issues. The US and other countries take in a pretty small share, but it's an important share and important for those people that we are able to help. President Trump's administration was pretty skeptical about, why the US should take on refugee resettlement and the value for our country in doing so. We used to be the global leader in permanent refugee resettlement. We passed that torch to Canada, but President Biden is committed to taking it back. He's said that he'll raise the refugee ceiling to a pretty high level of 125,000 for next year. We'll see, the feasibility of that, and it's going to take a lot of work to ramp up a refugee resettlement system that shrank during the Trump administration. And refugee resettlement used to be something that wasn't so contentious in the United States. There used to be a lot of agreement across the aisle politically that it was an important part of what we do as a country to protect refugees, but it has become more politically divisive and probably is more so today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And then in terms of legal immigration, most immediately, the State Department and US Citizenship and Immigration Services have these enormous backlogs, and how are they going to dig out of them? But even once we take care of that, hopefully, there are big questions ahead for our legal immigration system, questions about how many immigrants we admit to the country and how many immigrants we should admit, and how they should be admitted. The majority of our permanent legal immigration system is based on family ties, and some argue that we should be allowing more people in based on an employer sponsor, based on ties to the US labor force and economic contributions. Our legal immigration laws haven't been changed since 1990, despite the fact that our demographics have changed, despite the fact that our economy has shifted from a manufacturing economy to a service sector-based services-based economy. We've seen, the tech boom. We've seen so many changes during this time, and we've seen changing origins of immigrants, but our policies haven't changed. So we at MPI argue that there needs to be more flexibility in immigration policymaking. We need to create some kind of mechanism that can allow our policies to change more often so that they can stay in line with our national interests, with our economic interests, and with the demographic trends that are happening today. So these are a lot of issues, and there's probably a whole other list I could give, but there's some big policy questions ahead. It seems like Congress mostly wants to focus on the border these days, and maybe, as I said, Democrats are interested in focusing on some kind of legalization, or maybe there's bipartisan support for some kind of DREAM Act. Changing our legal immigration policies is something that seems lower on the agenda. Someday, when we've dealt with some of these bigger, more pressing issues, maybe there will be space to deal with changes to our legal immigration system. But I would argue that our legal immigration system problems there are behind a lot of our other problems. If there were legal pathways for people to come to the United States when they wanted to come and work, maybe more people could come legally rather than coming to the border and trying their chances in the asylum system or in other ways. So some of these issues that are less pressing for Congress, I think, are actually really pressing in terms of good management of migration to the United States. But I'm going to leave it there. I'll turn things back to Roland, and I look forward to your questions.
Welcome back to the Summer Lecture Series 2021. Our moderator for this session is Michelle Wasslin. She is Program Coordinator at the Institute for Immigration Research in Washington, D.C. In her role, she tracks and analyzes immigration research and policy, writes on related topics, coordinates with the work of the Immigration Research Institute, and builds relationships with academics and other experts. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Roland. And I also just wanted to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for inviting me to be a part of your wonderful summer series. And thank you so much to Julia for providing a very clear, concise, informative conversation about what is a very complex and difficult and emotional topic. So thank you. We have received a lot of fantastic questions, so I am going to do my best to get through as many of these as possible. As expected, a lot of the questions had to do with unauthorized immigration, Julia, and I thought that we could take even one step further back. You explained that the U.S. has a very generous legal immigration system, that the majority of immigrants in the U.S. are either naturalized citizens or legal immigrants. Can you please explain why then do we have unauthorized immigrants in the first place, right? Why aren't they just getting in line? Who under our current system qualifies to come to the United States legally? Are there quotas for different countries? Have there been recent changes, et cetera?
Great, and thank you so much for joining, Michelle. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you. So our immigration system has a quite complicated set of quotas and caps. The biggest way that people can come to the United States legally is through family sponsorship. So if somebody abroad has a spouse or a parent in the United States who is a citizen or green card holder, that spouse or parent could sponsor them, depending on the exact circumstances, but could likely sponsor them for a green card to come to the United States. And once somebody has a green card for permanent residence, and once they've lived in the United States for 5 years, then they become eligible to apply for naturalization to become a US citizen. Another way that people can come is if they have an employer sponsor. Our employer-sponsored system for permanent immigration is pretty small though. So overall, I mentioned that we give out about 1.1 million green cards per year. About 2/3 of those are through family ties. Some family categories don't have caps, and some family categories have caps. Basically, US citizens have more rights to sponsor their relatives without numerical limitation, whereas green card holders are more likely to face caps in sponsoring family members. But our employment-based system has just 140,000 green cards per year. And that 140,000 includes not only the worker who's being sponsored, but also their immediate family, their spouses and minor unmarried children. So we're really bringing in actually only about 70,000, about half of that, in sponsored workers each year in terms of green cards. So there are a complicated set of caps for each category of family-sponsored immigration and each category of employment-sponsored immigration. And most employment-sponsored permanent immigration is for higher skilled workers. The system was designed to attract the best and brightest around the world, and also to bring in college-educated workers to fill higher skilled jobs. And there's a pretty small number of employment-based green cards, just 10,000 for lower skilled workers. So it's pretty difficult for lower skilled workers to get green cards to the United States. Within each of these caps, there are per country caps. So no more than 7% of green cards within any category can go to one country. And that presents problems for countries that send a lot of immigrants to the United States, or that send a lot of people through temporary worker programs who then want to switch to a green card, and they face really big backlogs from certain countries. India is really affected by this issue. But so if somebody around the world doesn't have a relative in the United States who's a US citizen or green card holder, if they're not college educated, there are very few ways for them to come legally to the United States. Some of them could maybe come as a temporary farm worker if they're willing to do the really difficult backbreaking work of working in the fields, especially as we've seen farm workers have been affected by wildfires out west and by the heat dome in the Northwest and by all kinds of difficult conditions on top of just the difficulty of this physical labor. Most of the farm workers who come on our H-2A farm worker visa come from Mexico. It's easy for recruiters in the United States to find willing and able workers in Mexico, so they often don't look further around the world for those workers. There's also another temporary work visa for lower skilled workers, the H-2B visa. That also is mostly used by Mexico, but also by some other countries. That's for seasonal jobs. So working in landscaping, jobs that only happen in the summer, working in resorts in places like Maine that mostly have tourists in the summer, working in the seafood industry, things like that, amusement parks. That's a pretty small and numerically limited program. So a lot of people all around the world, and a lot of people in Mexico and Central America, don't have a way to come legally to the United States. Maybe they don't have a relative in the United States, they don't have a college degree, and maybe they don't know about these temporary work visa programs, or they're not able to find an employer. They have no experience in farm work, they're from a city and they don't know anything about that. They have no way to come legally, and if they're facing a dangerous situation at home or facing a level of poverty where they don't know how to feed their children, coming to the US border and trying their luck is probably the best option. Some people coming to the border have some idea of what might happen, but I think most people coming to the border really don't know. They just know that they, can't stand their current situation anymore, that there's more opportunity in the United States, and that they want to, try and cross and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of people are surprised by that we have this generous system, but there are very strict rules. And that for many people, there simply is no line, that you have to have a close relationship with somebody in the United States, a family member or an employer who can petition for you, right? It's really the person here in the United States that's doing the asking and not the person abroad necessarily. And even if you have that relationship with that person because there are many more applications every year than there are visas available. You might still be in a backlog for a very long time. And some people don't want to wait 10, 20 years to get their green card to be reunited with their family member here in the United States. So, I think we suspect that many of the people who are living unauthorized in the US are actually part of those backlogs. There's also a question about the border and asylum that I think fits along with this, because we've referred to illegal migration, illegal entries at the US border. Could you clarify, is applying for asylum legal? Is that legal immigration?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think some people talk about it as irregular migration. That's a term that's used more in Europe. Somebody hasn't asked for permission before they came to the United States, but it's not illegal to come to the border and ask for asylum. That is a legal process. People have the legal right. Once somebody is on US soil, they have the right to ask for protection in the United States, to ask for asylum. But again, they're not asking permission before they come. And that's because there is no way for them to ask for permission before they come. You can't apply for asylum from outside of the United States. You can't go to a US consulate in El Salvador and say, the gangs are threatening my daughter and we need to leave. You have to get onto US soil before you ask for protection. We do have our refugee system. That's a way that people can get protection from outside of the United States, but you actually have to be outside of your country of birth, of nationality, in order to get refugee protection. This is coming up right now, just to give one example in terms of Afghanistan. So the US has announced that it will designate certain categories of Afghans who have worked for the US government for refugee status, but they first have to get out of Afghanistan to get that refugee, to ask for that refugee protection. And that happens in rare occasions in Central America, that people are able to flee their country and they're able to apply for refugee protection, but we let in quite a small number of refugees from Central America. So most people in Central America, really the option that they see is to flee their country, to get to the United States, and then to ask for asylum.
There were also several questions for you about comparative immigration studies. How does the US system compare to other countries around the world, particularly Canada and Mexico? And are there any lessons that we can learn from other countries? I know that could take a week to discuss, but is there anything that you'd like to say about comparative immigration systems?
Yeah, I think a lot of people look to Canada and see a really orderly immigration system. Canadians tend to be pretty happy with their immigration system. They bring in more immigrants on a per capita basis than we do in the United States, but it seems to work really well. So Canada is often praised as a model. And I think there's good reason for that, but there are some really big differences between Canada and the United States. The first is that Canada has us as their southern border rather than Mexico. So there's not a lot, there's some people from the United States who want to go to Canada, but not huge numbers. So there's less pressure at the border. And the other difference is that they have a parliamentary system. So they don't have this tension between the president and Congress and trying to make immigration policy. Once a government is in place, they're pretty aligned. So what Canada has is a point system that's the main path for a lot of their legal immigration. And basically people can earn points for different kinds of human capital, for their educational attainment, for their fields of study. They can gain a lot of points if they have an employer who's offering them a job offer. They get points for having English or French skills, language skills, for having other kinds of ties to Canada. And so Canada is able to kind of rank all of the applicants, and then they skim off the top the people who have the highest number of points. So they're able to attract a really high skilled immigrant population, but also that has the skills that are a good fit for Canada. If they see that they need more lower skilled workers, they can adjust their point system and give points for working in particular occupations where there's a need for labor. Or the provinces in Canada also have a say. If what they need is a certain kind of worker, the provinces can select some immigrants. So it's a really flexible, adaptable system, the government can really quickly change how the points are allocated or what the points threshold is to change the number of immigrants coming and the kinds of immigrants who are coming in order to serve whatever is in the Canadian national interest in that moment. I think that flexibility is something that could be really, really helpful for the US. As I mentioned, we haven't updated our legal immigration policy since 1990, and they're no longer really aligned with what we need as a country. And it would be great if we could have that flexibility. It's harder to do in our governmental system, but it could be possible. We at MPI have called for the creation of an independent government body that could be staffed by experts, economists, demographers, immigration policy experts, that could look at our labor market needs, look at our past immigration streams and how immigrants are doing, and recommend, regular changes to our immigration policy to which kinds of immigrants we select and how we select them. And the goal would be to take some of the political heat off of Congress, to make it easier for Congress to pass immigration policy changes because they would be recommended by this really well-qualified group. So yeah, so more flexibility, I think, is a really big lesson that we could take from Canada, even though there are some reasons why it might be hard for us to work just in the way that Canada does.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And that really anticipated another group of questions that we had about really this balance between family-based immigration and humanitarian-based immigration and skills-based immigration, for lack of a better term. And, I think that Americans feel very divided about this, that in some cases we know that it's hard to find workers in some industries here in the US, and that we need foreign workers to fill those positions. But then there's also a concern that immigrants are taking jobs away from US citizens, or perhaps taking funding away that could have been used to better train US citizens to take those jobs. So do you want to talk a little bit about that balance, about how do foreign-born workers affect US workers in terms of employment, wages, any other fiscal and economic things you want to discuss?
Sure. Yeah, that is an area of a lot of concern. Economists, because of these concerns, economists have been looking at this question for quite a while and trying to come up with every methodological trick that they can to try to really isolate the impact of immigrant workers on the wages and the employment of US workers. And there's been kind of a consensus that's building, even as more and more studies are added to the literature, that for the most part, immigrants are complements to US workers. So, we talked about unauthorized immigration, a lot of people coming from Mexico, a lot of those were lower skilled workers, people who didn't have a college degree, who didn't have a high school degree in many cases. They were filling jobs that a lot of Americans didn't want to fill, not only in farming, but all kinds of, so-called dirty and dangerous jobs that US workers who are increasingly educated didn't want to fill. So for the most part, immigrant workers are complements. Also on the high skilled end, we bring in a lot of foreign workers in the tech industry, and there have been fewer US born individuals, even those who go on to get graduate degrees. Many specialize in fields that aren't IT infrastructure related, but we are increasingly reliant on workers, especially during the pandemic, to keep our technology running, keep our IT systems working. So immigrant workers have been complements in that way. There are some areas of competition. So the US workers who do seem to be harmed a little bit by immigration are US workers who have less than a high school diploma. And there seems to be a small impact of immigration on their wages, less than 10%. And a lot of the people in the United States who don't have a high school diploma actually are earlier waves of immigrants. So the biggest competition of immigration is on earlier waves of immigrants. And most competition that does happen between immigrants and US workers happens in the short term. Over the longer term, people adapt and they find their niches. One thing that can happen is that when immigrants come into a new area, the US workers actually move up in the hierarchy. So in construction, if suddenly a lot of immigrant workers come in, the US workers become the managers because they have the English skills and kind of the fluency and ease with talking with other Americans that the immigrants may not have. So they actually might move into higher wage jobs and can kind of ease that competition over time through adjusting exactly what role they play. And Michelle, what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that that's very helpful, and I think that this dichotomy that people draw between family immigrants and skills-based or worker immigrants is unfair in some respects, right? Because when U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents petition for family members and those family members come to the United States, for the most part, they are working, right? They also may have skills, they may have high levels of education, they may not, but they're certainly not qualifying for welfare and sitting on their couches, right? That immigrants that are coming here as family members of US citizens and green card holders are also workers. And, I think that a lot of people also try to unfairly look at immigrants, very numerically in terms of how much they put into the system and how much they take out of the system. And we have to remember that immigrants are people, that immigrants are workers, but they're also taxpayers, they're consumers, they are homeowners, and they're contributing to the US economy in many different ways. And I think that some of that nuance gets lost in some of the discussions that we tend to have in this country.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, I think that's a really great point. And that's something that sometimes gets lost, is that there aren't a fixed number of jobs in the United States. It's not that there's a set number of jobs and some are filled by US workers and some are filled by immigrant workers. As you said, immigrants come, they spend money, they pay taxes, and they grow our economy. They create more jobs. When more immigrants move in, there's a need for more grocery stores and more pharmacies and more of all kinds of services. And that creates jobs for US workers as well as for immigrants. So more immigration kind of grows the pie of jobs as much as immigrants fill jobs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I know that over the past year and a half, you've also done a lot of work on immigrant essential workers during COVID. And, I would love to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about that. I know that there are many hero workers, US citizens and immigrants alike, but could you talk a little bit about the particular contributions that immigrant essential workers have made?
Yeah, early in the pandemic, we looked at the roles that immigrants are filling in our labor force and how they fit into the jobs that were, really quickly we came to see that were essential during the pandemic, and saw that a lot of immigrant workers, about 6 million immigrant workers, are working in these essential industries. So that includes growing food. We know that immigrants are a really big share of farm workers, but also a lot of other roles. A high share of physicians in the United States are immigrants. I think 38% of home healthcare aides in the United States are immigrants. So they were, helping people who are homebound but needed healthcare assistance still during the pandemic. Immigrants are research scientists at high rates. And we saw that not just in the United States, but also internationally, immigrants were vital to the vaccine research that we're all benefiting from today. And in grocery stores and manufacturing of essential products, immigrants play a big role. So yeah, immigrants disproportionately fill jobs in some of the industries that were deemed essential. And I think that's also why there's been somewhat of a push for legalization of unauthorized immigrants who worked in essential industries as well. In the times when we were all, the most trying to stay at home, trying to stay the most isolated, we saw that it was immigrant workers who were still running local grocery stores, who were doing the deliveries of restaurant food and groceries that we were relying on, and filling all kinds of roles at personal risk in many situations during the pandemic. And so some have called for legalization for those who filled those roles, who took those risks during the pandemic.
Thank you. I want to move on to a couple of other questions here. First, do you have any data on the number of unauthorized immigrants that are leaving the United States?
That's a great question. We don't in the United States have data on emigration, period, whether those people are legal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants, we don't really know. We do have data on annual deportations, and as I think I mentioned, those were pretty high in the late 2000s and kind of the early years of the Obama administration. And then the Obama administration put some priorities on immigration enforcement and really focused its deportations on people with serious criminal convictions or people who had recently entered the United States, and deportations fell a lot. President Trump tried to increase them, but due to a lot of state level policies trying to limit interaction between local law enforcement and immigration enforcement, they didn't increase so much. And President Biden has put back into place some enforcement priorities, which has lowered deportation. So no, we don't know exactly. I mean, the shrinking of the Mexican unauthorized immigrant population, that has to be because of return migration to Mexico. So we know that that's happening kind of indirectly, but I don't have any numbers in my head, unfortunately. I don't think we really have the data on immigration numbers.
Thank you. We had a couple of other questions regarding the border and specifically mistreatment of children along the border. And Francis Beal asks if you have any statistics on how many children were separated from their parents during the last administration and how many have been reunited with their families.
So just to give a bit of context on the family separation issue, what happened under President Trump's administration is that he announced a policy of zero tolerance of illegal border crossing. So crossing the border illegally is a federal crime. Crossing the border again illegally is also a federal crime. The government has the option of charging migrants for that federal crime. That requires them to go to a federal court and maybe serve time in a federal prison. Often they're in prison for a couple days awaiting that trial, and the judge will sentence them with time served. That's the most likely outcome of those trials. But in order to crack down on illegal immigration or border crossings, the Trump administration said they would try to charge every single person who came across the border with that crime of illegal entry, put them into that federal court system. What happened and what they knew would happen is that in order for adults to go to those federal courts and face that federal criminal charge, if they came with children, were separated from their children because children are not placed into federal prisons. The children were placed into the separate system of shelters that's run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. That's the system of shelters that unaccompanied children who show up to the border alone, go into. And the really huge problem that happened was that there was no tracking of which parents came with which children. So when the parents were sent to the federal court system, the children were sent to the shelters for unaccompanied children, there was no linking record saying these children came with these parents. Once the parents are done with their trial, they should be reunited with their children, and they should, whatever happens to them, whether they're sent back or whether they're allowed into the United States, that should happen together. So President Biden, so this policy was put into place. There was a huge public outcry in the summer of 2018, and there was also litigation at the same time. So because of this outcry and because of the litigation, the family separation policy was ended. President Biden put into place a task force to try to reunify the parents and the children who were still separated. And this task force says that they identified about 3,900 children who had been separated from their parents during this family separation policy. And a little less than 2,000 have been reunited. A lot of those are reunited through court action within the United States, but some have been reunited through the efforts of the task force, but there's still over 1,000 children who haven't been reunited. And this work is really quite incredible. There are people who are riding on motorcycles around the countryside in Central American countries, trying to find a parent that everyone has lost track of to try to reunify them with the children. So this is a really painstaking and slow process to try to reunify the remaining separated children with their parents.
Thank you. Switching gears just a little bit, David Smith asks, what are the outcomes of hearings at the immigration court? So I assume he's talking about the asylum hearings for all the people who are applying for asylum. What is happening? Are people actually receiving asylum, or are they being denied their asylum claims?
Yeah, so the process, as I said, is long. It takes several years. So when somebody shows up at the border, and if they're not expelled, if they're allowed into the United States, they're given a notice to appear at immigration court. And that notice should give a time and date when they're supposed to go before an immigration judge. And then the first appearance, they can say that they would like to file for asylum in defense against their removal from the United States. Or what happens in many cases is they say, I don't have a lawyer and I would like a lawyer, and the judge gives them time to find that lawyer. If they say that they want asylum, then they're given another date to kind of hear that asylum claim, and that's what will be maybe 3 years into the future. There's a lot of fall off. So some people never find a lawyer to help them. They never get their asylum paperwork together, and they're never actually able to file for that asylum claim. Some of those people will be ordered removed, what's called in absentia. They didn't show up to their next court hearing and they were ordered removed. Of those who do file their asylum paperwork, some will get asylum, and I'm unfortunately forgetting the exact statistics that I used to remember about how many are getting asylum. That rate has been declining, or did decline under the Trump administration because of tightening rules about who qualified for asylum. There were some internal decisions that said that domestic violence or gang-based violence were not valid claims for asylum. And of course, those are the claims that a lot of Central Americans are presenting. So that did lower the chances of people winning their asylum court case, although some still did. So some people are getting asylum. A lot of people who have come to the border in recent years, we don't know yet because they're still in the middle of their wait for their court, their day in court to hear their asylum claim. So it's going to take some time before we can see, that big number of people who came in 2019, how many of them get asylum. We're not going to know that for another several years. But so yes, it can be difficult to make it all the way through the process for people who struggle to find a lawyer. But for those who do, they do have a decent chance of getting asylum, especially now that President Biden has overturned some of these precedents. So has overturned the decision that said gang violence didn't count and overturned the decision that said that domestic violence didn't count. So I do expect that the asylum grant rates for those who do complete the process will go up.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have another set of questions that really have to deal with Americans' attitudes towards immigrants and where some of the antipathy towards immigrants is coming from, and how do we try to unite people, I guess. And I kind of want to start this off by going back to one of the first charts that you showed us that really showed that that immigration to the US had been high at the turn of the last century and then really bottomed out right in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and has been increasing ever since. And I think for me, that's very telling, right? Because I think that a lot of people's attitudes towards immigrants kind of hinge on where in that graph they came in, right? If you are older and you came of age during the 1960s or 70s when immigration was very low, you have just seen this huge skyrocketing immigration your entire life. And that might be exciting, but that might be very scary, right? But many young people have been all their lives, they've seen increased immigration and this immigration from different regions of the world, which is, the diversity in immigration that we didn't have decades ago. So anyway, I wondered if you wanted to respond to that at all and just kind of talk about Americans' attitudes towards immigrants.
Yeah, so Americans, not uniformly, but generally tend to support legal immigration. And we saw increasing support for more legal immigration during the Trump administration, maybe a response to the fact that the Trump administration seemed to be opposed to both illegal immigration, but also legal immigration. And I think a lot of Americans may have said, I am concerned about illegal immigration, but I think legal immigration is a benefit for this country. But it is true that change is a scary thing for all of us. There have been periods where there have been a lot of state and local policies to restrict immigration. So states and localities tried to see if they could do something to limit immigrants coming in through new policies around who could rent or who could have a water bill, or trying to limit at the state level who was authorized to work, or what kind of immigration enforcement was happening around work in the state. And we saw those policies that were trying to restrict immigration pop up not in the states that had the most immigrants, but in the states that had the fastest growing immigrant population. So it was in the southeastern United States. Those were places that had small immigrant populations, but also had really quickly growing immigrant populations as immigrants dispersed across the country from the states of first settlement like California and Texas and New York. They started to move into new parts of the country that had really strong labor markets and cheaper housing and a lot of attractive qualities. So it was that pace of growth. And this is something unfamiliar to me. This is something new. My community, I'm used to the way that it is, and now it's changing. That seems to be an unsettling period. And then once people have more exposure to immigrants, their children go to school with a lot of children of immigrants, suddenly people become, oh, not an immigrant, but my neighbor or my friend. And then things tend to become less scary, and there tends to be less opposition to immigration. So there does seem to be this kind of adjustment period. The other thing that affects attitudes towards immigration is what's happening at the border. During times like right now, where the nightly news will have pictures of big groups of people showing up at the border, and those charts that I showed you of high, rising and really high apprehension numbers at the border, that gives us all a sense that our immigration system is out of control, that the government is not, having the power to select who comes to the United States and select those immigrants who would be beneficial for us, but that the system is out of control. Migrants are making the decisions, the government can't control it. That tends to decrease support for immigration. So having orderly migration, well-managed migration seems to be really important for maintaining public support for immigration. And that's why I say that Canada benefits from having us as its southern neighbor. In Canada, the government really is in control of immigration. There's a very small unauthorized immigrant population in Canada because they're surrounded by oceans and are another rich country, and really can control who comes into the country, and that can build that support for immigration.
Yeah, you make a lot of really good points. And yeah, something I hadn't thought of, that not only did we see this big increase in immigration in recent decades, but that the immigrant population has really dispersed across all 50 states, whereas it used to be much more concentrated in about 6 or 7 states. But now many states that are not traditional immigrant receiving communities are seeing these kind of sudden large increases in their immigrant populations, and that can be scary. And I think a lot of this, given the complexity of the immigration system, given the fact that many people are not starting with the same basic facts about immigration, the fact that this is a very emotional issue that people feel very strongly about. It's a very political issue that many politicians are using immigration as a wedge to try to divide people, right? That we have a lot of misinformation as a result of the complexity and the emotion. There is also a lot of misinformation about immigration. So, we had a couple questions here about data and narratives, right? How do we go about educating people about immigrants and presenting the type of information you presented today? And is that what is going to sway people's opinions, right? We have a question here from Regina Edmonds, who says, I've worked to change the narrative about who immigrants are and how many benefit the US greatly by using the arts, poetry, songs, stories, etc. You're using important data-driven modeling. Do you think there's a way to integrate these two approaches so that we generate greater empathy for and understanding of immigrants?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think it's true that people don't necessarily know how our immigration system functions. And I think our government doesn't always do the best job at communicating how our immigration system functions. So some basic facts I think might be helpful. I think a lot of people don't know that the great majority of immigrants in the United States are here legally. I think sometimes people hear so much in the news about illegal immigration and unauthorized immigrants, and that they start to think that most immigrants are unauthorized, or at least most Latin American immigrants are unauthorized immigrants, which also isn't true. But ultimately, I think that our human brains are wired for stories. So often it is stories that change people's minds, or that personal experience of getting to know somebody who comes from another country and hearing all of the struggles and trials they went through with their immigration system. Our immigration system is so complicated, and even for people who do everything completely the right way and have, the best opportunities for migrating, sometimes struggle because of all of our backlogs and our red tape and all kinds of issues. So hearing those stories personally, I think, can change minds. It's something that when I was in graduate school, I was studying children who lived in mixed status families. So US citizen children living with unauthorized immigrant parents, or unauthorized immigrant children who had US citizen siblings. And after I would give talks, people would come up to me and tell me about the classmates that their children had in school and the legal immigration challenges that those children were having. So I think as immigrants are more and more a part of more of our communities, of our schools, our churches, our, just who we interact with on a day-to-day basis, more people hear the stories of immigrants. And I think that does change minds. But it is a slow process, and trying to change people's minds, we know, is very difficult. So I think that stories and arts and movies and books and everything are as important as facts. But I do think spend most of my day working with data. I do think data is important, and I think that there are some basic facts that people don't know. So sharing those can be helpful as well.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And I think that there's polling that shows that even people who have very restrictive ideas about immigration find it much more difficult when they know a person, right? When it's the person who sits next to you in the pew in church, or the person who goes to school with your child, or your own house cleaner, it's a little bit more difficult to have those very anti-immigrant views the more that you come into contact with and have positive experiences with individual immigrants. I have a quick question and then a longer set of questions, and then we're going to quickly run out of time here. So are the people that are coming to the United States, either across the border or even people being admitted legally to the US, are they being tested for COVID?
Not systematically. People who are people coming to the airports, I believe, are supposed to now have a negative test. I don't know if you know this, Michelle, for tourists. Okay, I think they're supposed to have a negative test, but I have to be honest, I haven't completely kept up with those policies. At the border, people are not being systematically tested because of COVID-19. What the government is trying to do is process people through the Border Patrol stations really quickly. They don't want big groups of people in overcrowded buildings spreading COVID-19. So they're trying to process people quickly. So they're not testing everyone. If people show symptoms at the border, they will be placed into some kind of isolation, whether that's in hotels or whether that's in a government-run facility. A lot of people who are allowed into the United States go pass through shelters that are run by a wide variety of nonprofit organizations that operate along the border. And I believe that some of those service providers may be doing COVID testing. I also saw in the news this morning that the United States is going to start to offer the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to people at the border, not for those expelled under the CDC order, but for those who are allowed to enter into the United States, they will be offered a COVID vaccine. So that should also help the situation. But we've often seen that the COVID rates to the extent that there's data, the COVID rates of migrants coming in are actually often lower than the COVID rates in the United States, because we've had such bad outbreaks at various times in the United States. And especially right now, Texas is having a bad time with the Delta variant. So the COVID rates may be higher within the United States than in the migrants who are coming in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So kind of to wrap up here, we had several questions regarding what do you recommend? How do we confront some of these issues, and how do we move forward? So, David Smith asks, if you had 5 minutes alone with President Biden, what advice would you give to him?
Gosh, that's such a tough question to think of what I could say in 5 minutes. I think my biggest recommendation is that even though it feels less pressing to fix our legal immigration system, I think it's actually something that could help a lot of our problems. As you kind of suggested, Michelle, with your very first question about, do people have legal ways to come? A lot of people don't have legal ways to come, but they have a lot to contribute to the United States. Right now, we're seeing, hopefully this continues despite the Delta variant, but we're seeing strong economic recovery in the United States. A lot of Americans are really eager to go on vacation for maybe the first time in a long time. And that's leading to strong demand for workers, but maybe not enough available workers in certain industries in certain parts of the country. In the Midwest and in hotels and restaurants, businesses are really struggling to find enough workers. At the same time, we have a lot of people coming to our border who want nothing more than the chance to come into the country, to be able to live in safety and to be able to have jobs where they can better support their families. So there could be a lot of win-win. If we created policies that allowed people who want to come legally, to allow employers to sponsor the foreign workers, that would really help their businesses in cases where there aren't US workers. Of course, we should be concerned about the competition between immigrant and US workers, even if it works out in the medium run. In the long run, we don't want to create that short-term competition, but where there is strong labor demand, where unemployment rates aren't so high, it makes sense to bring in more immigrant workers. And our legal immigration policies, in terms of employment-based immigration, there's no pathway for people who want to fill a lower skilled or maybe even a middle skilled job that's a year-round job. We have temporary visas for farm work and we have temporary visas for seasonal jobs. We don't have any temporary visas or any green cards for lower skilled or middle skilled year-round jobs, despite the fact that we really heavily rely on immigrants to fill some of these jobs. I mentioned home healthcare aides. There are a lot of jobs across our economy where we rely on a high share of immigrant workers. And these are jobs that are projected to grow into the future. All kinds of service jobs and jobs in the healthcare industry that don't necessarily require a bachelor's degree are projected to grow given our aging population. And these aren't jobs that can be automated necessarily. Working with people is hard to automate. They aren't jobs that can be sent overseas because, again, working with people requires people to be present in the United States. So there's going to be strong demand ahead for a lot of lower and middle skilled year-round jobs. Immigrants are already filling those jobs because they get them after coming through the family-based system. But it makes sense to me that we should reform our employment-based system to also recognize these contributions, the needs in our economy, and then the contributions of immigrant workers. And that would have the added benefit of creating legal pathways for people coming from Central America, from Mexico, from other parts of the world who right now have no way to come and want to come so desperately that they show up at our border to try their chances. So I think that reforming our legal immigration system could help with the pressure on our asylum system and this, awful immigration court backlog that we're having. It could help with the border numbers that we're seeing, and it could prevent future growth in our unauthorized immigrant population. So I do think that legal immigration reform is really important. But I also think that addressing the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States is really pressing. It's not a good situation to be in, to have 11 million people in the country who don't have full rights, who don't have access to safety nets, which we've seen as, such a devastating thing during a natural disaster, during a pandemic, during these situations that keep arising. So, I don't think we have the resources. I don't think we have the political will to deport everyone. I think there should be some kind of pathway to some kind of legal status for many of the unauthorized immigrants in the United States. If people have a clean, criminal background check, if they've been paying their taxes, they've been contributing to the country, there should be a path to legal status. So that's probably over 5 minutes, but those are kind of two big recommendations I would make.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. As you said, that much of the unauthorized population in the United States has been here for well over a decade. There are people who have been working and paying taxes and who have established roots here, who have US citizen families here. And we really need to look at a legalization system that's fair. And I think that you made a couple of really important points there, that many people want to focus on the border, right, and on illegal immigration, and that we need to fix that and get a handle on that, and then we can move to legal immigration. And as we've seen, there's always some crisis that people have that we need to fix immediately, and we never actually get to reforming the legal immigration system. But in reality, if there's one thing that's crystal clear to me, it's that illegal and legal immigration are, so intertwined, and that in order to resolve unauthorized migration, we need to look to our legal immigration system, and we need to update that so that we have a well-functioning system for the 21st century. We're the United States, and we don't have that. We have a system that has not been updated for decades. So I really appreciate your answer to that. So do you have any final words before we turn this back over to Roland?
I think we've covered a lot of territory, but I do think that's a great takeaway. It's just that that waiting to reform the legal immigration system is not serving us, and that there always will be other crises, but that attacking some of those fundamental problems in our system could really relieve the pressure and relieve some of these other issues. And we've actually have seen that from Mexico. I didn't mention this as one of the factors in the decrease of unauthorized immigration from Mexico, but we actually increased our farm worker visas from Mexico. And you can kind of see lines crossing, decreasing illegal immigration and increasing farm worker visas from Mexico. So we know that it can work, that legal immigration can be a good solution. But just thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. And thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you both. That was a very informative and interesting discussion of such complexity in our immigration system that has both humanitarian and political issues that need to be resolved. And you've helped us understand that all so much more. Thank you therefore to our speaker, Julia Gelatt, and our moderator, Michelle Wasslin. You've done a marvelous job. We hope that all of you in the audience have enjoyed today's session. Next week, we will hear from Bill McGibbon, Professor of Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, who will speak about climate change. Not too late. We hope to see you then.